Well, I want to thank the Global Blake Network for organizing this event, and Jason and Anise for their help. I'd also like to thank Lindsay Weinberg for her help in preparing my presentation and for her useful comments on early drafts of this. Yeah, so my first book is out on epic poetry in the Romantic era. This that I wrote may become part of a project on Blake and Joyce at some point in the future, but for now, it's a talk. All right. I'll just begin. Lots of Blake in Finnegans Wake. James Joyce gave a lecture on William Blake in 1912. His previous lectures at an Italian university in 1911 had concerned Irish politics, but in 1912, his topic was realism and idealism in English literature. In this talk, he discussed Daniel Defoe as a representative of the former, realism, and William Blake of the latter. What strikes me in the fragment of his lecture that remains is the extent to which Joyce sees realism and idealism as interwoven. He speaks at one point of the spiritual origins of realism and of a prophetic sense in Defoe's realistic art, not just representing reality, but offering through it symbols. The finished artistic expression of this prophetic sense, Joyce says, is Robinson Crusoe, whom Joyce takes to be a true symbol of British conquest, the prototype of the British colonist. Obviously, Blake also has a prophetic sense, but his is broader than Defoe's, consisting of what Joyce calls a divine humanity, partially inspired by Emanuel Swedenborg's vision of heaven in the form of a man. So obviously, Blake has a prophetic sense, consisting of Emanuel Swedenborg's vision of heaven in the form of a man. Joyce, in his talk, emphasizes how Blake's visionary work is inseparable from the mundane details of his life. In one part of the lecture, he describes Blake arising after a night of inspired art to make tea and breakfast for Catherine Blake as she lay under the covers of their bed, a curious anticipation of Leopold Bloom's first appearance in Ulysses. The ending of Joyce's lecture is lost, but the last sentence of the remaining text begins at the bottom of that slide. And although he based his art on such idealist premises, convinced that eternity was in love with the products of time, the although clause makes it seem likely that Joyce was about to pivot into synthesizing idealism and realism, or rather arguing explicitly that these two artistic impulses can be complementary, an idea that resonates with Joyce's own approach to art, culminating in his final novel, Finnegans Wake. Critics have long noted that there are a number of similarities in the structure of Finnegans Wake and Blake's final long poem, Jerusalem. For example, both works have 4 parts. Both concern a fallen, dead, and/or sleeping giant who represents all humanity, and whose various aspects acquire their own individualities, including female aspects and emanations, parts of the psyche that battle with each other before reconciling so that the sleeping giant may arise into new life. The similarities between the world of Finnegans Wake and Blake's mythology were noted among early commentators by Joseph Campbell and Henry Morton Robinson, who in their 1944 study of Finnegans Wake, 1944 is just 5 years after the novel was published, they compare Blake's Albion in his long poems to Joyce's HCE, the slumbering giant, whose initials signify, among other things, here comes everybody. HCE. And they write, Joyce's image of a fundamental sleeping individuality, Albion, around whom revolve the figures of the 4 Zoas, and whose emanation is the symbolic Jerusalem, and who will not awake from his universal dream until the last judgment, is precisely HCE. In my talk today, I'm going to argue that Joyce, in fact, draws upon Blake in ways that critics have not fully appreciated. I will argue that Joyce extends Blake's subversive transformation of the epic tradition in his long poems, especially Jerusalem. While Ulysses is typically regarded as Joyce's major engagement with epic literature, I argue that Finnegans Wake more radically engages it by adapting Blake's Jerusalem into a postmodern, postcolonial reflection on empire's fragmentation of the world and on the possibility of creating global unity. Blake's appeal to epic tradition was influenced by the epic revival of his day. At the time Blake was writing Milton and Jerusalem, more epics were written than at any other time in history. And this is the period between 1790 and 1820. A great deal of these poems were, to use Blake's terminology, fabled by the daughters of memory. While some writers recruited the genre for progressive ends, a great many were dull, imitative poems that aped the classical and Miltonic epics and, in the process, often advocated a jingoistic nationalism and tyrannical imperialism, enslaving the minds of readers to the sword, no less than the works of the Greeks and the Romans that served as their models. As critics have argued, neoclassicism was used to support nationalism and advocate the concept of duty to state. From Blake's perspective, the epic revival of the Romantic period helped create the mind-forged manacles that promoted global injustice. Epic is a notoriously difficult genre to define, and critics have suggested that its ambiguities account for its enduring popularity and the tension of its form. Many works throughout history have been labeled epics while varying in length, subject matter, devices, with seemingly little to link all of them together. Some critics have argued that epic can be defined by a spirit of grandeur, an attempt to sum up the world in encyclopedic ways. Others hold that epic should be thought of less as a genre than a tradition in which poems claim membership by reiterating its tropes, so invocation, extended simile, and so on. Each epic could therefore be conceived as a kind of collaboration with tradition, but it is a tense collaboration that frequently descends into competition. Critics have noted that epics often vie against their own tradition, repeating its conventions while insisting on the superiority of their own age, themes, and values. The lack of a clear set of rules for epic poetry, coupled with the tendency for rivalry among epic poets, renders the genre a destabilized space, a battlefield of ancient tropes and modern ideas. This instability and tension made it a useful tool to respond to the turbulent politics of the Romantic era. It's noteworthy that the epic genre has also traditionally been associated with ideas of stability, unity, and national identity, concepts that would have been appealing to writers in the wake of the French Revolution. A common critical narrative is that the writing of epic poems declined as the aristocracy waned after the 17th century, and then in the 19th century and beyond, epics and poetry in general were displaced by the novel. And yet this critical narrative is at least incomplete, because the 19th century was full of epic poems, densest in the Romantic period, poems that spoke to the condition of their world. We're accustomed to thinking of Romantic epic in terms of unconventional poems and fragments. Yet canonical Romantic epics were the exceptions rather than the rule. A great many complete and conventional poems bearing the name epic poured from the presses during the Romantic period. In fact, the annual, called Poetical Register and Repository of Fugitive Poetry, during the first decade of the 19th century, divided its reviews between epic and heroic poems and miscellaneous. Many Romantic era epics promoted forms of nationalism, supported the goals of empire, and worked in part to affirm a stable, unified British identity, framed against savage others around the world who needed to be civilized, conquered, and/or converted. These poems include Henry James Pye's Alfred, Robert Southey's Madoc, John Ogilvy's Britannia, and a host of even lesser-known poems. They didn't survive as part of the literary canon, but the world Blake moved in was awash in them. Blake's long poems both do and do not fit with conventional ideas of epic poetry. They indeed embody a grand scope, and they do reiterate aspects of the epic lineage while partially repudiating it. Consider Blake's use of invocations, catalogues, lengthy similes, allusions to classical and Miltonic poems, and so on. Indeed, Blake worked at the epicenter of the epic revival. His patron and friend/antagonist, William Haley, played a key role in igniting the revival with his seminal and influential essay on epic poetry, a 1782 verse epistle that encouraged English poets to take up the genre to address national subjects. Blake's long poems concerning the rise and fall of Albion seem like an answer to that call. Haley and Blake even read the Iliad together in 1801. And as the author of a popular biography of Milton, Haley was responsible for a resurgence of interest in the writer that the English considered their greatest epic poet, one who lived through a turbulent revolutionary time that many people saw mirrored in the age of the French Revolution. Blake's poems make frequent use of Miltonic language, imagery, and tropes, down to making John Milton himself the hero of one of his poems. The Romantic epic revival was, in a sense, returning Milton to earth by trying to mimic him. Writers sought to copy his religious epic or write the national epic he considered but never penned. Seeing Milton revived for the purpose of shoring up nationalism and imperialism, Blake returns him to earth to combat those forces. It would seem reasonable to conclude that Blake's long poems are indeed epics, which he composed as the popularity of the genre grew during the Romantic era. Yet Blake's long poems also subvert expectations readers would have of epic poetry. Although epics are typically associated with unity, stability, and national identity, Blake's long poems often strike readers as disunified, unstable, and critical of conventional conceptions of identity. While several other canonical poems of the period are incomplete or fragmentary in a variety of ways and for a variety of reasons, owing to the exigencies of revision, publication, etc., Blake's epics embrace fragmentation. They are produced in such a way that each plate could stand on its own as a separate work of art. Each copy of Milton in Jerusalem is unique, as no two extant copies are identical. Blake's epics thus not only defy the idea, going back to Aristotle, that an epic poem should be unified, they actively undermine it. And in terms of content, Blake repeatedly invokes epic tradition in his long poems, explicitly framing his work as an antagonistic response to the classical tradition. References to classical epic often symbolize the forces of restriction and imperialism against which he strives. In short, Blake adopts aspects of the epic genre, but rather than creating a cohesive, unified text, he embraces fragmentation and subverts the unifying and totalizing tendencies of epics. He attacks, by extension, the unifying and totalizing energies of empire. He rejects the conservative respect for tradition, and he further assaults the discursive categories that underwrite empire. In addition to undermining the epic genre's claim to unity and wholeness, Blake's embrace of fragmentation challenges the idea of a stable British identity that could be neatly contrasted with a savage other. Everywhere in Blake's long poems, the categories of self and other are deeply unstable, as characters blend into each other. When the speaker of Jerusalem declares at the beginning of the poem, "I am in you and you in me, mutual in love divine," it not only announces a key theme of Blake's poem, it causes us to wonder who exactly is speaking. It may be not only the poem's speaker, but William Blake, the author, the artist prophet Los, the fallen Albion, the fallen Jerusalem, or God himself, or all of them at once. I want to look at one particular part of Jerusalem to serve as an example of Blake's dynamic and subversive engagement with epic. Early in Jerusalem, he portrays Los surveying the world, like Adam at the end of Paradise Lost, who beholds all of salvation history at once. Los sees Blake's entire mythological world, including all of fallen time, before him. Plates 12 to 16 function as an epic catalog, detailing the Blakean cosmos and Los's creative endeavors. Traditionally, catalogs create a sense of epic as a unifying, totalizing, almost encyclopedic form. And Blake both generates this sense and undermines it by framing and interrupting his catalog with illustrations. This is no straightforward list of warriors attacking Troy in Book 2 of the Iliad, or the Roman emperors marching in the underworld in Book 6 of the Aeneid. Both of those famous examples are encyclopedic listings that support war and conquest and imperial power. Blake reinvents the device of the catalog to stress how inspired art should resist the totalizing energies of epic and empire. The layout of the plates performs its content. On these plates, Los perceives the divided state of the world and works to rectify it by entering it through his artistic productions. The first two plates, with marginal ornamentations, are followed by two plates with illustrations that take up the bottom third of each. That is, as the catalog wears on, Blake's images become more prominent and interrupt the catalog, at the same time as Los beholds the effects of the fall. On these plates, the language repeats, he views, Los beheld, Los beheld, I turn my eyes, I see. He also sees the past, present, and future all at once. It's in the second stanza there, third line from the bottom of that second stanza. Los looks and sees the past, present, future all at once. Again, like Adam in Paradise Lost. Los sees, I'm going to go back to Los sees the effects of English imperialism growing into a polypus that extends from Albion to the entire earth. It is as if the act of an inspired artist seeing clearly the conditions of the fallen world begins a process of resistance to empire, a process signaled by the increasing intrusion of images into the catalog. The catalog culminates in plate 16, where now the images disappear entirely, and Blake gives us the busiest plate thus far in the poem. 69 lines squeezed into a wall of words. On this plate, Los moves from beholding the effects of the fall and begins to act. The words, here Los fixed, describe the central action, and these words are positioned close to the center of the plate. He fixes down, on this plate, Los fixes down the counties of England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, giving definite form to the countries joined by the 1801 Act of Union. Los's work here partially consists of tracing the effects of the fall. The Act of Union was part of the construction of what Blake calls Albion's specter, part of the imperialist polypus that spreads dominion across the globe. But Los's work is also a creative gesture that begins to rectify that fall. The plate traces imaginary correspondences between these counties and the tribes of Israel, suggesting that apparently distinct nations are not as distinct as the fallen mind would have it. The busyness of this plate, 16, so busy and so full of seemingly pointless details, as if almost to parody the device of epic catalog used in warlike imperial epics, underscores how Los more fully enters the fallen world through his work, much as art must manifest in the world to influence it. Los, in a sense, enters the world of empire's totalizing dominion, signaled by the lengthy catalog. The movement of these plates, again, from divided catalog to near parody of a catalog, mirrors how Blake's art embodies fragmentation but strives toward unity. Yet Blake seeks in his art not an imperial unity, which depends on a hierarchy in which self is exalted over other, but a mutual exchange, where I am in you and you in me, where there are no fixed selfhoods, but the acts of continually building and continually decaying, continually capable of reinventing nations and selves through art. That idea of continually refreshing the world through art, that idea of continually refreshing the world through art appears at the end of the catalog. Part of the survey of the universe on these plates stresses how the events of history are not lost to the creative imagination, which, when it is fully realized, is not bound by history. For Blake, all possibilities, all potentials, are real and can be perceived by the imagination. These possibilities include that subset that has actually transpired. These possibilities include that subset that has actually transpired, which we call history. But to a fallen mind, the events of history are the only things that are real. They seem the only substances, the third to last line on that slide. Such individuals in their fallen state are closed to the potential that an artist can access. These possibilities are embodied by the sculptures in the halls of Los. I'll read this whole thing. All things acted on earth are seen in the bright sculptures of Los's halls, and every age renews its powers from these works. With every pathetic story possible to happen from hate or wayward love, and every sorrow and distress is carved here. Every affinity of parents, marriages, and friendships are here, in all their various combinations wrought with wondrous art, all that can happen to man in his pilgrimage of 70 years. Here, Blake is essentially describing archetypes, images that recur in art and in life. These statues in the halls of Los sum up all human possibilities, and the ability to perceive them and open to their influence and creativity is part of Los's creative work that acts as an antidote to empire. As the artistic creations of a divine being, these statues resemble divine craftsmanship in a famous episode of epic tradition, the images on the shield of Achilles. In the Iliad, Book 18, the gods deliver new armor to Achilles, including a shield decorated with images that encapsulate the universe: the sun, moon, ocean, a city at war and a city at peace, marriages and funerals, work and celebration. In Blake's vision of the world and history in Jerusalem, he extends not only Milton with the panorama view of history, but also Homer. Blake's hero, Los, does not carry representations of archetypes into battle. The hero of Blake's poems is the force that creates these archetypes, that produces and manifests possibility. As Blake gives a stunning survey of his mythological world, he represents the forces of oppression, like the serpents that oppose the priest Laocoon in the sculpture based on Virgil's Aeneid, at the last two lines there. Reasonings like serpents enfold around my limbs. Blake's own version of the Laocoon, produced in 1826, shows how he appropriated classical art for his own purposes. He surrounds the classical statue with Blakean aphorisms, winding around the figures like serpents of his own. In these aphorisms, Blake asserts that classical art misunderstood poetic truth, essentially misunderstood those archetypes in the halls of Los. Classical art misunderstood them as literal history, reducing the story of the fall to the natural history of Ilium. The implication of those lines in Jerusalem, where Blake sees his opposition as serpents winding around him like around the Laocoon, is that the destruction of Troy, which the Laocoon anticipates, the destruction of Troy is a parallel to the attempted destruction of Jerusalem. But where Virgil's Aeneid addresses what the Romans believed to be historical fact, that a hero salvaged Trojan civilization to live again as the glory of Rome, Blake imaginatively appropriates classical imagery to defend his concept of liberty or Jerusalem. Blake's idea of Jerusalem runs counter to the imperialism represented by Rome and perpetuated into Blake's day by the British Empire. But the British Empire looms large on these plates of Jerusalem, excuse me, extending through the globe. Those minds trapped in the fallen world are at the mercy of this polypus, but Blake suggests it is possible to break free of the hold of what he calls selfhood and embrace imaginative potential. To be clear, I don't think one needs to believe in the supernatural or be a dualist to find this idea powerful. And for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to set aside a long digression I wrote about whether or not Blake is a dualist. Suffice it to say, the fall described by Blake could simply refer to our mind's tendencies to be caught in limiting ideas of ourselves and the world, our tendencies to acquiesce to impoverished ideas of personal, national, racial, and imperial identity that are shaped by the discursive systems of imperialism, that divide the globe into nations, into oppositional groups, into imperial subjects and exotic others. To see the events of history as the only substances is to be locked into such restricted views of oneself and the world, blind to broader ways of thinking about them. Blake suggests that art is a way of broadening one's ability to conceive of the self and world. And Blake's unique art, blending text and image, and adopting and reframing and subverting aspects of the epic tradition, challenges and disrupts our normal process of reading. This disruption, I would argue, parallels the way that Blake seeks to disrupt our everyday ways of reading or interpreting ourselves in the world. I take James Joyce's art in much the same way. Though he doesn't literally illustrate Finnegans Wake, except, of course, for the Blakean diagram in the center of the book, he compares the wake in several key places to the Irish Book of Kells, a 9th century illuminated gospel manuscript whose wild designs call to mind Blake's visual inventiveness. Joyce himself noted to Arthur Power that, quote, "You can compare much of my work to the intricate illuminations of that book, and the wildness of Finnegans Wake, the inventive mashing together of words, recalls the Book of Kells much as it does Blake's work." Like Blake, Joyce draws on epic tradition in creating a work that summarizes the world in encyclopedic fashion and stirs a sense of grandeur. Joseph Campbell puts it like this: "If our society should go smash tomorrow, one could find all the pieces, together with the forces that broke them, in Finnegans Wake." And like Blake, Joyce matches the form of his epic to its content. Recalling Milton's dismissal of rhyme as a bondage in poetry, Blake notes that blank verse could be as much a bondage as rhyme itself. Instead, he sought in Jerusalem to put every word, this is from the beginning of Jerusalem, he sought to put every word and every letter into its fit place. He says terrific numbers for terrific parts, mild numbers for mild parts. Joyce similarly claimed to fit every word and letter of his text to the content. He said that he was seeking to allow water to speak like water, birds to chirp in the language of birds. And Samuel Beckett famously argued that Joyce's words aren't about something, but are the thing itself. When Joyce writes about sleep, for instance, the words don't report sleep. The words go to sleep. Both Joyce and Blake push the limits of artistic representation to match form and content as they try to encapsulate the universe, an attempt that links their work with epic tradition. Blake broadly as an adaptation of Jerusalem, a work in 4 parts. It treats history as the dream of a fallen giant who possesses 4 major aspects. Joyce calls them, at one point, the 4 zoons, excuse me, who are the equivalent of Blake's 4 zoas, but here the word mixes them with zones, making explicit how Blake's characters function not just as individuals, but as locations and worlds. And by punning on the word koan, a word that refers to a paradoxical riddle in the Zen Buddhist tradition, whose purpose is to baffle the rational mind and induce enlightenment, he emphasizes how these constituent parts of the sleeping humanity are psychological states that can be pathways to enlightenment. And much as Jerusalem centers on the artistic efforts of Los to push back against the forces of restriction that produce in the fallen world prudish morality, tyranny, and imperialism, Finnegans Wake is presented as the artistic creation of a character called Shem the Penman, the imaginative side of humanity, which is denounced and oppressed by the overly rational, literal-minded, nationalistic, and violent aspects of humanity. Finnegans Wake itself is represented in the text as a letter written by Shem, who it turns out was actually collaborating with, and in fact taking dictation from, his mother, the emanation of HCE, called ALP, Anna Livia Plurabelle. For sure, there are many differences between the works. As an obvious example, Joyce gives more agency to his emanation figure, and he never denounces the female will in the way that Blake does. But both works fundamentally concern the fall of humanity away from a state of harmony and creativity into war and division, love and jealousy, and especially into imperialism and injustice. And both posit as a cure for the fall, as a cure for the fall, creativity, the work of the artist, and ultimately a surrender of the idea of the self as separate from the universe. Pause here for a drink. Finnegans Wake not only broadly adapts Jerusalem, it develops Blake's attack on three interrelated phenomena: the epic genre, the totalizing narratives of empire, and limited notions of human identity. Joyce expands on Blake's generic and formal innovations to produce a postmodern, postcolonial epic whose embrace of fragmentation speaks to the fragmenting of European empires and the nationalisms that precipitated the world wars. Excuse me. Joyce knew Blake primarily through William Butler Yeats and Edwin John Ellis's 1893 edition of his poetry, and this edition contains reproductions of the plates of Milton and Jerusalem. So Joyce was familiar with Blake's artistic style and with the layouts of the plates. This edition also contains a prefatory essay that gives an interpretation of Blake's system of symbols, so Joyce was likely influenced by that as well. Finnegans Wake is less a novel in the way we would normally think than it is a language experiment. The book is written in a babbling language of puns, one whose syntax and appearance is what Joyce calls basically English, but which plays on words from dozens of languages, often meaning several things, including contradictory things, simultaneously. The premise of the Wake is that it is a dream, not unlike the dream of Albion and Blake. Its strange language mimics the meandering motion of a dreaming mind. It is a stream of unconsciousness, as it were. It is apparently the dream of a Dublin citizen who acts as an everyman, hence his initials HCE. He's compared to the character Tim Finnegan from the Irish vaudeville song Finnegans Wake, who is a hod carrier, a construction worker, who drunkenly falls from a ladder and dies. At his wake, a brawl breaks out among the mourners, and in the confusion, a bottle of whiskey is spilled on his corpse. In Irish, the word for whiskey means water of life, so Tim rises from the dead and begins to dance. In Joyce's hands, this silly song becomes an allegory for the fall and resurrection of humanity, which links it to biblical tradition. So the dreamer entering sleep and rising into waking consciousness at the end of the night is to Finnegan falling off his ladder and rising from the dead, is to each person, each of us, falling into what Blake would call selfhood, and each of us suffering guilt from personal transgressions, and each of us rising into a new life of self-acceptance, forgiveness, and embrace of imaginative possibility. However, the text never arrives at waking. It famously ends back at the beginning, concluding in the middle of a sentence and beginning in the middle of the same sentence. Drawing on Giambattista Vico and on Nietzsche, Joyce suggests that history is cyclical. History is, to borrow a phrase from Blake, ever building and ever decaying, moving toward an end that never arrives. The Wake not only describes, but embodies the way that archetypes manifest through mythology, literature, and everyday life. Here, Joyce develops epic tradition. In the Homeric epic, the archetypal images were ornamentations on a shield that a hero carried into battle. Blake makes his hero the creator of the archetypes, the artist prophet who represents the imagination in each of us. Joyce's Finnegans Wake goes a step further. His heroes are the archetypal images themselves. The adventures of the sleeping giant and his dream avatars appear as a kind of eternal story whose various aspects recur through all of art, literature, mythology, and history. The fall of Finnegan off the ladder recurs as Adam in the Garden of Eden, as Napoleon defeated by Wellington, as literary characters like Heathcliff becoming a villain in Wuthering Heights, as the dying and reborn gods of multiple world myths, and as the average Dubliner, plagued by guilt over fantasies and indiscretions. HCE, Here Comes Everybody, is an archetype that emerges in all of those stories, all of which appear in various parts of Finnegans Wake, and other aspects of the dreamer serve as other archetypes. Throughout the book, Joyce draws upon epic tradition. For instance, the book opens literally in medias res, in the middle of a sentence. and the first page functions as a kind of invocation. The structure of the book, delving into the dreamer's unconscious mind, resembles the epic device of underworld descent, katabasis, it's called, and it frequently draws on allusions to caste itself as a kind of epic, one that transforms its tradition by radical innovation. Among these references, the fall of HCE is linked consistently to the fall of Troy. A common critical narrative is that the modernist period could only approach epic with a self-conscious sense of the belatedness of modernity. So writers like Joyce engage with epic primarily through parody and mock heroism, embodying not the monologic voice of the classical epic, but the polyvocal voice of modernity expressed in the novel. Yet in Ulysses, Joyce does not merely poke fun at modernity through epic comparison. He also elevates the commonplace and the everyday. And I would argue that Finnegans Wake carries this technique further by suggesting that all experience and all consciousness partakes of those archetypes that Blake calls the statues of Los. In Blake, this cosmic vision explodes traditional conceptions of identity promoted by imperialism and by the various nationalisms that precipitated the world wars of the 20th century. Like Blake, Joyce is advocating a broader conception of the self, encouraging each of us to read reality differently and dare to narrate the story of ourselves to ourselves differently than we do, not as oppositional members of warring tribes, but as part of a dynamic global community. Some critics have suggested that the bizarre language of Finnegans Wake, puns that operate in multiple languages at once, combining different syllables from words of various tongues, are ways of advocating a mixing of nations and cultures. Joyce's Shem the Penman, his parody of himself and a rough equivalent to Blake's Los, is mocked by his brother as a Europe-Asianized Afro-Yank, mixing together the influences of Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. While a full reading of Finnegans Wake is outside the scope of this talk, and I would say outside the scope of a human lifetime, I'd like to look briefly at how Joyce transforms the device of the epic catalog in a moment of Finnegans Wake that parodies traditional instruction in the humanities. It doesn't really matter that you can't read the words of that. It's the appearance of it that counts. It's the layout. In Book 2, Chapter 2, the sons of HCE, Sean and Shem, who represent the extroverted and introverted aspects of humanity, do their homework before bed. The chapter is written in a style that resembles a school book with marginal annotations and footnotes. The annotations on each side of the page are attributed to the two brothers, the footnotes to their sister, and altogether the entirety of the text represents the dreamer. At the end of the chapter, a summary of the lessons appears as a catalog of great figures throughout history. The marginal annotations on the left name the individual, while the main text alludes to that individual in some capacity. As in Blake, the catalog is fragmented. The device of the catalog summons the idea of unity and encyclopedic completion, but its depiction on the page here underscores division. At times, it's challenging to keep track of which name matches with which parts of the text. Through this fractured catalog weave the novel's archetypal characters in various historical guises. For instance, when Homer is listed in the margins, he corresponds to part of the text that reads, "Describe in homely Anglian monosyllables the wreck of the Hesperus." The footnote reads, "Able seaman's caution." Like much of Finnegans Wake, almost every word and phrase could be seen as having the effect of an epic simile, joining together disparate parts of the world. In these handful of words, Homer joins Longfellow, Odysseus, and the biblical Abel, together with a sex joke punning on the word seaman. It's interesting that this catalog is one of, if not the longest, sustained sections of standard English words in the entire novel, with few amalgamations of English and foreign words. It is as if the language of the British Empire is here used to sum up a catalog of the great figures that Western culture, including the British Empire, claims in its lineage. But even as Joyce represents this unity, its depiction on the page calls attention to division, pointing to fractures of that empire and looking forward to the fracturing of the world in the post-colonial period. Like this catalog suggests that the archetypes weave their way through history. In other places in the Wake, characters who embody certain archetypes seem to have epiphanies where they realize that the universe is much vaster than their limited perspectives. An example of this occurs in Book 2, Chapter 3, where a tavern keeper, a version of HCE, defends an earlier version of himself, whose story has just played over the radio in the bar. In this speech, he describes his unnamed transgression, his version of the fall from the Garden of Eden, as culpo de Dido, recalling the wrongdoing of Dido, queen of Carthage, in seducing the Roman hero Aeneas, who had fled from the fallen Troy. So, as happens elsewhere in Finnegans Wake, the fall of humanity is associated with the destruction of Troy. This phrase is also a garbled version of corpo di Dio, body of God, an exclamation as well as a declaration of the divinity of HCE/humanity. Here as elsewhere, Joyce plays with the idea of the fortunate fall, the notion that the fall was ultimately positive because it brought about the greater good of redemption. In his rambling speech here, the tavern keeper describes turning through the pages of a suppressed book, probably Ulysses or Finnegans Wake itself, and receiving from it the sense that there is more to the universe than meets the eye. The syntax is, more so than elsewhere in the book, peppered by qualifications and asides, such that a reader easily loses track of which clause modifies which. The syntax becomes as muddled as the character as he searches for a defense of himself. He has a dim impression that he is, the bolded part, cadging hap-snots of distend renations. He's not just taking snapshots. He's catching perhaps nots, other possibilities for himself, in other lifetimes or incarnations, which are figured as his distant relations. The idea of perhaps and perhaps nots calls to mind the ways that the terms possible and probable, taken from Aristotle, echo all over the Wake. They are most clearly expressed in a wonderful sentence from Chapter 5, where the dreamscape of the novel is described as a place where the possible is the improbable, and the improbable the inevitable. Everything that is possible will come to pass, no matter how improbable. The haps-nots are not merely distant relations, but distant nations, where the story of humanity continues to play itself out all over the globe, in all the nations that have distended from HCE's own giant body, much as the nations of the world fled from the limbs of Albion in Blake's myth. Through the colpo de Dido, HCE has the opportunity to catch a glimpse of these perhaps nots, the possibilities. The end of this speech weaves references to Columbus, Magellan, capitalist contract law, and the idea of contracting back together. Following the fall and the imperialist nightmare of history, ushered in by the age of exploration, HCE is all together, but also, the last word, all too good. This is the fortunate fall translated into historical terms. The nightmare of history, the empire that Blake depicts as a polypus, was necessary to inspire the greater good of true cooperation. The ability of the creative imagination to make contact with those possibilities, I'm almost done here, this is the very conclusion, is expressed in a moment where Shem the penman is called pious Aeneas, the hero who carried the civilization of the fallen Troy to found a mighty empire. But here the artist draws on the energy of the fall to attempt to reverse its effects. In this passage, Shem creates his art by writing all over his body the only fool's cap available to him. By its corrosive sublimation, one continuous present tense integument slowly unfolded all merry voicing, mood molded, cycle wheeling history. This corrosive sublimation of his art recalls the way Blake describes his art working by corrosion in the marriage of heaven and hell. The slow fires of consciousness further recall the furnaces of Los. Through his art, Shem melts away the covering of what Blake calls the selfhood and opens a path to making contact with the revolving archetypes of the creative imagination, the archetypes that continually manifest in life and in art, and through which, as Blake puts it, every age renews its powers. Richard Ellman pointed out in his biography of Joyce that, like Blake, Joyce insisted on the mind's supremacy over all it surveyed. And I think that includes finding the universal in the particular, the archetypal in its everyday manifestation, the permanence of every sigh and tear in the human imagination, but also the ability of the imagination to move beyond what has been and create new ideas in the world, new ideas, new worlds, new art, and to continually refresh the world with art. I think overall, Joyce uses Blake as much more than a handful of surface level references and as much more than a rough framework on which to perform his literary acrobatics. I think Joyce was a perceptive reader of Blake and adapted his work into a kind of verbal composite art that sought, like Blake's long poems, to challenge our limited perceptions of ourselves and the world. Perhaps, if the anxiety of influence is true, or true of Joyce at least, he couldn't acknowledge the influence of Blake too directly, or perhaps couldn't fully acknowledge it even to himself. But what I find in Finnegans Wake is a development of Blake's transgressive style and a development of the epic tradition. Like Blake, Joyce responds to a world ruled over by empire, but also containing great divisions and fissures, a world in which individuals are caught by limitations, encouraged to think of themselves in relation to the nightmare of history. But like Blake's art, Joyce's has the power to disrupt readers' normal patterns of thought and lead them closer to waking from that nightmare. Thank you.